Tim Moore, and I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and director of Carnegie's Cyber Policy Initiative. Bill Burns has asked me to step in and to welcome you all to what promises to be a fascinating discussion. Earlier today, the Carnegie Endowment released a report that I wrote outlining a strategy for how we can better protect the global financial system against cyber threats in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. It is a blueprint with a detailed list of actions that central banks, government agencies, regulators, diplomats, and industry can take to achieve that goal. The report also provides a background analysis with context for each recommendation. I would like to thank the over 200 stakeholders who engaged with us over the past year as part of this project, and we encourage you all to take a look at our website after this event with more details. It is now my honor and great pleasure to introduce you to the first three speakers of today's event. We are delighted to welcome the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey. Prior to his appointment in March, Andrew served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Financial Conduct Authority. As CEO of the FCA, Andrew was also a member of the Prudential Regulation Committee, the Financial Policy Committee, and the Board of the Financial Conduct Authority. Before that, he held the role of Deputy Governor, Prudential Regulation, and CEO of the UK's Prudential Regulation Authority. It is also a pleasure to welcome back Congressman Langevin, representing the 2nd District of Rhode Island in the US House of Representatives. Congressman Langevin co-founded the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus back in 2008, when very few people paid attention to cybersecurity, and he has been a thought leader in Congress and beyond ever since. Most recently, he used his expertise and experience as a commissioner of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and deserves credit together with his fellow commissioner for its success. Finally, I would like to introduce you to Jeremy Jurgens, and thank you, Jeremy, and Sean Doyle at the World Economic Forum for the fantastic collaboration with Carnegie for this project and the opportunity to present it at the Forum's annual meeting in Davos earlier this year. Jeremy is Managing Director and Head of the Center for Cybersecurity of the World Economic Forum that hosted its annual meeting on cybersecurity earlier this week. He's responsible for the member and partner companies, essential to the mission of the forum to advance public-private cooperation. His responsibilities include oversight of all industry initiatives, the forum's offices in China and Japan, as well as the Center for Cybersecurity. Previously, he was the forum's Chief Information Officer, Chief Representative in China, and the head of the annual meeting in Davos. Jeremy will be moderating the fireside chat, which will be followed by a panel discussion. And I now turn it over to you, Jeremy, for the discussion with the governor and the congressman.
Great, thank you, Tim. It's good to have everybody here online. And why don't we just jump in? And Andrew, if I could start with you. Tim mentioned the report that we launched outlining this international strategy to better protect the financial system against cyber threats. When you look at this, what's at stake when we think about a major cyber incident affecting the financial system? And why is this a global challenge and not one that's just limited to the individual countries or the banks that have to deal with it? Over to you, Andrew.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And first of all, can I congratulate you and Tim and the Carnegie Institute and the World Economic Forum for producing such an important and actually timely and fascinating report. It really is an excellent piece of work. I mean, let me start by saying, until this year, I used to say that when I thought about the risks to the global financial system and how those risks had changed since the global financial crisis of over a decade ago, it was, in my estimation, the case that the risk that had come up the league table most rapidly in that period was operational risk, and within that, cyber risk was the most concerning and major component. It's the risk that had gone up the league table, if you like, most rapidly in the period, decade or so now since the financial crisis. And it's also another reflection I would give actually is to take a slightly longer context actually and say, if we go back to 9/11 for a moment, and one of the responses that we had to 9/11 and the threat that we saw there was that we had to get much better, what I call physical separation of our operating environments and their backups. But what we also did there was to say, yes, and the Federal Reserve implemented a distance policy, and many of us copied it, by the way, or versions of it. But actually what the second leg of that policy was to say you need physical distance, but you need to closely tie your sort of operating environments together so that you can almost seamlessly switch in response to a physical attack. And I go back to that point because then, of course, cyber comes along and cyber says, no, you don't do that, actually, because you might solve the physical problem, but you've just tied all your environments together. And the new risk is the one that goes over distance and will wipe out, corrupt or damage or in some way harm you. And I say that also because that's the way into the international question. You ask the question, what's at stake, internationally? Well, this is the quintessential risk that doesn't know borders. This risk goes across borders. It's not a respecter of sovereign borders in that sense. We have to see it in that context, because unfortunately, we know that is the sort of the theory and sort of structure of it. But we've had many now, incidents where unfortunately it has been all too apparent that this is the case. So that demands, a great deal of international cooperation and a great deal of joint working to counter that risk. And fortunately, we have now got a lot of very strong cooperation going. The G7, for instance, has been it's been a very good forum to do that in. And when I look at what are we actually looking at within that? Well, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking at cyber threats, obviously. Where is the threat coming from, and what form does it take? How does that form evolve? Because it does evolve very rapidly. I'll come back to that point a moment later. Secondly, obviously, in the context of the threat, what are our vulnerabilities? And obviously the interaction of those two things. So it's the interaction of the threat and the vulnerability. And thirdly, that vulnerability also links to this question of interconnectedness of the financial system and the increasing reliance of the financial system on data and information. Because of course, again, our experience is, if you can sort of boil it down, that this interconnectedness point, we see both cyber risks taking the form of disruption, but also, of course, the theft of data and information and potential use of that either for crime, ransom, whatever. So there's a disruption effect risk, but there is also a loss of information, crime, and ransom effect that follows from that. So when the authors of the report, when you use this term ecosystem, it's very apt, and it requires a collective response. It requires us to recognize the importance of innovation, both in the cyber world, but also in what we're doing. And my final point, I just want to come back to this point, of course, it is the risk that never stands still. Now, I'm not an expert of the US and the congressional system. I've had the pleasure of many sessions giving evidence in the UK Houses of Parliament. And if the congressman will forgive me, I always say there's one question that I often get asked, which is, as a regulator and as a central bank governor, which is, Mr. Bailey, can you assure me that this thing will never happen again? And with cyber, I say, not only can I assure you that it will happen again, it's probably happened while we've been talking, because of course that is the speed of evolution and that is the frequency with which we're attacked. Now, fortunately, the vast majority of those attacks, don't go anywhere. But that is the stark fact of life that we all face now. This thing evolves incredibly rapidly, and it is done with very high frequency and rapidity. And of course, the sad fact of that is that it is a risk that is not going to go away. We have to keep working to counter this risk, which is why this report is so important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to come back to this question on the operational risk, operational resilience. But first, I'd like to ask Congressman Langevin. You've co-founded the Cybersecurity Caucus in the US Congress now, I think, over a decade. You're well respected on both sides of the aisle for your expertise on cyber policy. And the financial sector has been at the forefront of cybersecurity for years, yet it's still vulnerable to cyber attacks. Why is that? Despite all the investments that we've been making there, the actions we've been taking, where does this vulnerability come from? And what do you think we can do, and what's necessary to protect the financial system?
Yeah, so Jeremy, thank you for the question. I'll say that obviously we have a very determined adversary or enemies out there. As an old friend of mine used to say, who's a former detective, wherever there's money involved, someone's going to try to steal it. And so again, we have very determined enemy, and obviously a very complex system that we are trying to defend with a very vast attack surface, if you will. But before I get more into that, let me just first of all thank you for moderating today, and I want to recognize and thank Tim Muir and Arthur Nelson for their excellent work on the strategy. Hats off to you both and to the team. Tim in particular has been an insightful voice on these issues for years. I also want to recognize here at home outgoing director of CISA, Chris Krebs. Chris has done an outstanding job there. I really lament that he was let go and ostensibly let go for basically doing his job and doing it well, which makes no sense. But to the issue at hand, let me just say Governor Bailey made some excellent points about what we're concerned about. So let me offer a few thoughts, if I could, about why it's difficult to address these risks. So number one, the financial system obviously is incredibly complex. And as I said, we are trying to defend a very broad attack surface. So that complexity can lead to great efficiency, but it also means that our resilience sometimes comes up short. And it means that understanding the implications of an attack across the ecosystem really can be quite difficult. Number two, we have a living, breathing adversary, and as I said, a very determined one. Threat modeling for many shocks to the financial system is based on the counterparty trying to find a way to make money in the system. In cyber, someone is actively trying to undermine the system. And then number three, cyber really is the perfect tool for gray zone conflict. You'll be able to react below that level of armed conflict, if you will, that would raise to a threshold of crossing a clear line. In gray zone, you can act in a lot of ways almost with impunity and bumping up against that red line that would force this harsh visceral response. But our adversaries, can reach out and touch us at home from half a world away without having to physically cross any borders. And cyber tools also have a wide range of payloads that lets nations basically dial in effects that are below that level again of armed conflict. Number four, the private sector really owns most of the assets critical for our national and economic security, and they're on the front lines. In many countries, our national security establishment is used really to protect a domain not interfacing with entities operating within that domain. And so these four are among the reasons that it's been difficult really to get a handle on cybersecurity challenges. But certainly we are all working on it. I will say that the Cybersecurity Commission, which I was proud to serve on, really has a number of recommendations to better protect critical infrastructure, and that's including the financial sector, a very important area of critical infrastructure. So one thing that I'd say we have to do better is, first of all, organize for the fight. And in fact, we often look at some of the work that our allies in the UK have done with their National Cybersecurity Center as a model. And I have to say, I'm quite envious what the UK has been able to pull together, and it really is an impressive effort. Now, domestically, here in the United States, one of our top priorities for us and for me has been and will continue to be creating a national cyber director within the White House to really exercise policy and budgetary authority in implementing a national cyber strategy. So close related, and that really has been, by the way, one of the major things that's been missing, that you didn't have that person in charge with you. Again, that could reach across all of government and achieve the desired effects that we wanted to achieve in strengthening cybersecurity. So closely related, we need to improve operational collaboration between government and the private sector. Information sharing is not enough. We need to work hand in hand with people who understand the sector and its networks best. And in the financial sector, it looks like empowering entities like the FSR and strengthening the roles of sector risk management agencies are incredibly important. So these are the things that we are focusing on. It's not just about information sharing. It's about we need to make sure that we're putting context to this issue so that people that are on the front lines and say people in the intelligence community say can connect the dots better in understanding what we're looking at. Finally, I'll just say that we need to understand the international dimensions of the challenge and continue to work with our partners and allies to strengthen norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. At the end of the day, cyber will only become less enticing attack vector for our adversaries when they realize the consequences of their actions, that they're not acting with impunity, that they can be dealt with harshly or effectively to deter them in the future.
Great, thank you, Congressman. I'd like to come back to Governor Bailey, and you talked around this connecting the dots. The UK's been at the forefront of thinking about this, of taking a proactive stance, connecting the dots nationally, but also bringing in the international community. 2 years ago, the UK Financial Services Authorities published a paper that got widespread attention on operational resilience. Now, in our own work, we've often talked about cyber resilience. So I'd be curious to see, what do you see the relationship between the operational resilience and cyber resilience more broadly? And with this increased shift to operational resilience, how do we see the evolution or thinking around the broader thinking on cyber resilience? Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very important point. I see the two operational risk in cyber as very closely linked. Indeed, in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, they're parts of the same broader thing. I think it's useful to sort of give a bit of context here in terms of the way in which the financial system has evolved, and Congressman's mentioned this in his remarks. So the interconnectivity of the financial system has undoubtedly increased substantially, enabled by obviously technological innovation. Secondly, our dependence on it has increased. Now, that's not just a function of the fact this thing has increased itself, but actually the demands we place upon it. I mean, if you think about all of us as individuals for a moment, I mean, it's quite striking. I certainly speak to the UK now, that we expect to be able to interrogate our financial information at much greater regularity and frequency than was true in the past. I mean, it's quite striking that it's not that many years ago that we were content to live a life where we didn't actually need to be able to see what was in our bank account at any point in time that we wanted to. Moreover, innovation in financial services increasingly actually, in a sense, keys off the inability to use that data and that interconnectivity to put it to the use of consumers and users of financial markets. But of course, what we've created then is a system that is more complex, as the Congressman said, more interconnected, greater use of remote data facilities. Think about the cloud as obviously classic in the sense of the best example of that. And that, of course, it creates at least two vulnerabilities. It creates an operational vulnerability in terms of the the performance of that system, its availability, its reliability. But it also creates a vulnerability in terms of creating more points of exposure to cyber attacks. So I think the two things are very closely interrelated. I think that in order to really properly, in a sense, tackle cyber risk, we have to tackle operational risk, because we have to take all the steps we can do to reduce and mitigate operational risk. Because for the most part, most of the time, that will also address parts of cyber risk as well. I mean, it doesn't address all of cyber risk, but the vulnerabilities point that I made earlier has a lot of common ground between the two. So we see them as frankly, as very much interconnected, and we'll be taking them forward in that fashion.
Great, thank you. Now, Congressman, back to you. In 2018, you sent a letter to Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin with your Republican colleague, Congressman Royce. And you urged them to work with their G20 counterparts to strengthen international cyber norms with respect to the financial sector. Now, it hasn't happened. I don't think we've made as much progress as we would have liked. You also referenced, Chris is a good friend, I think, the international community and connecting the U.S. establishment in. What do you think is important, and what should be the top priority for the next administration in this area?
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you for that important question. So I'll begin by saying that I'm really deeply disappointed that the Trump administration has not made more progress in this space. And I really give full credit to Rob Strayer, State Department, for his work when he was there at State. But he was really hurt by the elimination of Chris Painter's position, something that I hope the Biden administration is going to quickly reverse. So let me talk about the why, if you will. In this, the financial sector is particularly important for norms conversation. So key to understanding this here is that really norms describe behavior. We should have aspirational norms of the behavior that we want to see, but do as I say, not as I do is simply not possible in this space. And so I think we have a pretty good idea through efforts like the UN's group of government experts, or the GGE, of what norms we aspire to, but putting them into practice by taking action when governments act outside their bounds, it really has proven to be more difficult than one would think, and that's a big problem, because we need to be able to to react quickly and decisively when states conduct destabilizing operations. You can't have a disconnect and do it years down the road. We need to get a time we can to a point where we're acting more quickly, so it's more relevant, the response more relevant to the action. The speed of international relations means that a response 3 years after an incident is going to really be interpreted in the current context of those two countries' relationship. So that's what we need to really keep in mind. Acting quickly and decisively means that we can't just rely on on cyber experts. We need to include subject matter experts to help determine the impact of an operation, and importantly, be prepared to act to protect the sector. And because of the relative maturity of the financial sector in cooperating to address complex international risk, especially after the Great Recession, it makes sense to start a work in a forum like the G20. So if a rogue nation were to attempt to destabilize the financial sector using cyber means, then we need to have a playbook of how nations will cooperate to prevent a devastating contagion and hold the malicious actor responsible. And some of this will work, of course. Some of this work would of course need to happen among ministries of foreign affairs and computer security incident response teams. But without financial ministers involved in, frankly, helping to drive the conversation, we're unlikely to build the resilience we need and unlikely to be able to speak with a unified voice to condemn these dangerous operations.
Thank you, Congressman. Now, I think we have time for maybe one more set of questions, and we've got a great panel coming up with Hannah Murphy from the FT that she's going to moderate for us. But before we go there, the last question, each of you. The report outlines 32 recommendations, for how we can, make progress in this space. If each of you in a minute, if you could give me your top 3 priorities from among those recommendations, what would you select there? Governor, to you.
Thanks. So I would start really with picking up the point the Congressman just made, which is that we must keep pushing forwards and really grip the question of international collaboration, it being necessary and urgent. UK's got the presidency of the G7 next year. We're working very hard to plan that, to have it ready, and we will certainly take that message on board. I think with that goes the question within that cooperation and collaboration goes quite the importance of greater collaboration about roles and responsibilities so that we're all very clear what we're doing. And I think the third one, and very much in the same spirit actually, is the one on reducing fragmentation and freeing up capacity to tackle the problem. Because, in a world of, now we need this reminder, not at all really in the world of COVID. We are all operating on very stretched capacity, dealing with a major global issue, a major pandemic. And yet we cannot lower our guard on the question of cyber.
No, thank you. Congressman?
So let me just say that obviously, really resilience it means that even more when disruption occurs and it's not catastrophic, it's recoverable because even though through failure modes we put in place processes and resources to mitigate and cover from even larger disruptions. So one of the important principles that have been driven home by the coronavirus pandemic is that there's a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. The leanest supply chain might be the most cost-effective in the short term, but single points of failure are fragile and they put society at risk if any one of them are disrupted. So in the Solarium report, we emphasize that to achieve resilience, we need to provide really a counterbalance to short-term market forces that emphasize only efficiency. And we need to spend resources on backup plans, on redundancies, on disconnects, on breakpoints. We cannot let dependency on algorithms get ahead of our ability to control them and recover if algorithms and digital infrastructure are attacked. So the first recommendations of Pillar 1 start to get at this principle, and I'd like to see the principle understood and embraced more fully. And it really applies regardless of your preference for market-based or more centrally based economies. Second recommendation, 1.7, really is timely in addressing influence operations as an important component of the modern threat landscape. The internet places us all in swirls of information coming at us all the time, and even if we earn our livelihoods doing physical work or physical or service work with other people, our news, our shopping, and financial lives are really mediated by looking and poking at our screens, right? We're all kind of addicted to our electronic devices these days. The problem is the information appearing on our screens is not always trustworthy. And so the financial system, of course, as we all understand, is built on trust. And one of the things that we quickly learned in the 2016 election was that cyber operations are a huge force multiplier for misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And a crisis of confidence in the financial system can have enormous ramifications. And it really is important that we incorporate and understanding of how information and cyber operations interact. And then finally, I want to just talk on and wind up with workforce. As anyone who's heard me talk about cybersecurity over the years has heard me say that, the best policies in the world are nothing without the right people to implement. And yet we continue to see these significant challenges with our cyber workforce. In particular, recommendations from point 2 call for financial service firms and where you call for financial services firms to provide resources to help augment cybersecurity workforce initiatives and widen the workforce pipeline. Whether it's the businesses together collectively create scholarship for service programs, which is important, almost on the idea of the Cyber Core program that we have here in the United States, or we have financial firms allow their employees, say on a Friday afternoon, to go and teach a class on cybersecurity while still being paid by the company. The companies can help to feed their own pipeline, if you will. So I can't overemphasize how important this is to our success. In a lot of my conversations on workforce, people curse financial services firms because they use their deep pockets to hire away the best, the terrific talent. And look, I myself may have been guilty of that too, as I try to attract cyber talent. But at the end of the day, we need skilled cyber professionals at CISA and JP Morgan Chase. And we need more people at Cybercom and at Chase. And the only way that we fix the problem is by growing the entire cyber workforce pie and not just focusing on growing your slice of the pie or your sector's slice of the pie. So I'll just close by saying, as leaders in this area, we're relying on the financial services firms to really step up to the plate and really help with this effort.
Great, thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Governor Bailey. And I'd also like to again thank Carnegie Endowment for our call to action on this paper and everyone for joining us for this insightful discussion here. Tim, passing it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you, Governor, and thank you, Congressman, in particular for the remarks at the end about the workforce, which we also believe is incredibly important. And actually, a few months ago, decided to already spin out a working group dedicated to this, considering the impact of the pandemic, following the adage that every crisis also provides an opportunity. So hopefully there's a way to make some progress on this in the coming weeks and months to build a more robust and diverse workforce and workforce pipeline moving forward. Thank you for this great kickoff and the fireside chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce Hannah Murphy, who covers tech for the Financial Times out of San Francisco. Hannah focuses on social media, Facebook, privacy, and cybersecurity, as well as cryptocurrencies and digital assets. You can follow her on Twitter at Miss Hannah Murphy. And I now turn it over to Hannah for the panel discussion with a great set of industry leaders and thought leaders on this topic. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. And it's a pleasure to be invited to moderate this session with such knowledgeable panelists looking at an important topic, which from my vantage point, covering this daily as a journalist, is only becoming more important and more relevant. So congratulations to Tim and the team on this very weighty report, and welcome to all our panelists. I'm very excited to hear your insights. So firstly, Rami, starting with you, you're the Chief Cyber and Technology Risk Officer of BNP Paribas, one of the largest global systemically important banks. What do you think have been some of the key trends in this wider landscape of cybersecurity, and what role has the pandemic played in shaping those?
Thank you, Hannah, for the question. Pre-pandemic, malicious cyber attacks on the financial sector were growing, and most organizations designed the risk appetite around the pre-COVID threat landscape and operating model. What we're seeing now is there are some potentially enduring changes that will challenge how we've been assessing cyber risk. Specifically, organizations have a much larger attack surface due to remote working, the interconnectedness that Governor Bailey has mentioned between financial firms, and of course, the increasing reliance on third parties and specifically cloud providers. All of this broadens the threat landscape and creates potential concentration risks. Clearly, the digital response to COVID-19 has succeeded in keeping the lights on, but it has also introduced some vulnerabilities. The remote work shift has created less oversight, and many companies didn't have initially the right controls in place. In this context, insider risk is an increasing area of concern. Ransomware attacks, as we all know, have spiked over the last 2 quarters, and no relief is in sight. And contrary to COVID-19, there is no broad spectrum immunization against every existing variant of ransomware. So boosting our defenses against this epidemic is really key. This could be done by ensuring that we build more defensible and resilient architectures. Additionally, despite extensive attempts by organizations over the many years to educate their workforce, spotting phishing emails and not clicking on malicious link, these attacks continue to remain high. Phishing volume has spiked by over 600% since the end of February. So we need to adapt and account for the fact that, especially in the context of the current crisis, human fallibility when working from home increases. So this is, by the way, an issue for both the workforce and the customers of the banks and the financial sector. And as highlighted in the report, DDoS attacks are getting bigger and more frequent. And what's more concerning to me is really the scale of the attacks. DDoS attacks of 1 gigabit per second are enough to impact most organizations, but now we're seeing peak attacks in excess of 1 terabit per second generated from thousands or millions of IoT devices. Finally, I think we need to keep in mind that the biggest issue of all is that of the cybersecurity operating model. It has to evolve to become more agile and function at cloud speed. We have to do this because our opponents do this. The state actors, as well as the organized hackers, they function at a really amazing speed. And we can only do this by leveraging more automation and harvesting more and more the cyber telemetry.
Thanks, Rami. A kind of mixed picture there. You've got more threat actors taking advantage of vulnerabilities as we move into the remote working world. Just turning now to Jen. You're in charge of resilience at Morgan Stanley after building the firm's Cybersecurity Fusion Center. And before that, you served at the White House for 5 years. How are you thinking about operational resilience, and how does cyber resilience play into that?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Hannah, and thanks to Tim and Carnegie and all of the contributors to what I think is a truly terrific report. You certainly heard a great rundown of all of the threats that we're dealing with across the landscape from Rami. You know, as you mentioned, I came to Morgan Stanley in 2017 to build and lead what we called our Cyber Fusion Center, which was essentially our center of gravity for assessing and detecting and responding to cyber threats and vulnerabilities that could incur risk to the firm. So we spent about 3 years fully operationalizing and building out that operating model. And then at the end of 2019, really in recognition of some of the things that Governor Bailey was talking about, this increasingly complex and really inherently interconnected threat environment, you know, as well as all of the increasing regulatory scrutiny and requirements around operational resilience, including cyber resilience, our team was asked to actually expand upon the Cyber Fusion Center to build what we called the Fusion Resilience Center. So bringing together our cyber response and intel capabilities, along with our technology incident management, our technology disaster recovery capabilities, our exercise program, and then our business continuity management program, essentially to build a cohesive firm-wide capability to ensure preparedness and response for any sort of business disrupting operational threat or incident, from cyber attacks and fraud to technology incidents to geopolitical unrest to weather events to terrorist attacks to infectious disease. So this ironically parachuted us in the middle of managing the firm's response to the pandemic, which in late January, I think seemed a bit counterintuitive to people given our roots in cyber, but ultimately it proved to make a lot of sense for some of the reasons that Rami laid out. Given the actual and potential cyber threats we've seen manifested throughout the crisis, specifically, both from entrepreneurial cyber threat actors taking advantage of the pandemic, playing upon fears and anxieties through lures and phishing campaigns for fraud and theft, and then, of course, because of all of the increased risks given our remote work environment. So we've spent the past year both managing the firm's response to COVID from a people and facilities perspective, but also from a cyber perspective. And at the same time, building an operational resilience program that aligns with the regulatory guidance from the US and the UK, as well as the Basel principles. But perhaps more importantly, that really instantiates a framework that focuses on ensuring the resilience of the firm. So effectively, as the Congressman alluded to, our ability to respond and recover from significant disruptions to the business. And the framework we've constructed involves the identification of our key business services, mapping them from front to back in terms of platforms and people and processes and vendors and financial market infrastructure and technology, of course, making sure that we can actively test these services against a range of severe threat scenarios, of course, cyber threat scenarios, and then identifying those gaps or areas for improvements and enhancing our ability to keep the firm operational resilient, of course, including resilient from cyber attacks, in particular, things like data destruction or data corruption. And in that context, I would echo one of your early recommendations on ensuring financial sector resilience, targeting the integrity of data. So I thought the report was really terrific in terms of some of the things that we've been doing and building and kind of validating the approach that we've been taking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. And turning to you, Sherry, you recently returned to the US after a successful tenure as the Group Chief Information Security Officer of Standard Chartered. That's a London-based bank, but it also has this significant presence in Asia Pacific. Just reflecting on your kind of global experience, how prepared do you consider the financial system to be for a major incident right now?
Thanks, Hannah. I think it's important that when we look at preparedness, that we look at the progress and recognize the significant work that institutions have done and the progress that they've made over the last decade to really strengthen their defenses. As you heard from Rami and Jen, there are still areas that need to be strengthened and improved. There's no question about that. But there's been significant innovation as well as investment, much of that facilitated by heightened awareness due to previously successful attacks, as well as the increased regulatory and industry regimes that have really driven security requirements and improved operational controls across the financial system. I think we can specifically point to work by the Bank of England, by the Financial Stability Board, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the UAE Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, who have all come out with specific new testing regimes in the last several years that are driving levels of assurance to greater levels than we've seen before. And I think it's also important that we not forget the massive undertaking to uplift the worldwide payment system that has been led by SWIFT and more than 1,000 of their financial institutions post the 2016 Bangladesh attacks. So all that being said, there's a lot of positive things that are being done around protection and preparedness. However, I think as Governor Bailey well said, cyber threats are borderless, and Representative Langevin clearly pointed out that operational engagement needs to go beyond just information sharing. And while those is a key aspect of preparedness, and progress has also been made with strengthening sharing organizations and broadening global inclusion beyond just the US and the UK. So if we look at the Financial Services ISAC, the Cyber Defense Alliance, work that Interpol, Europol, and others are doing. But there is still significant fragmentation today globally among government entities across the national security, law enforcement, response, and regulatory bodies, and even within countries themselves for building that collective response among their agencies and industry. So strengthening those cybersecurity controls, whether it's industry or regulatory driven, and reaching higher levels of cybersecurity resilience, as is very well stated in the report, are really, I would say, the next step and the next big drive and push that we're going to see. So that ultimately is why there is so much emphasis in the report on cyber resilience, collective response, workforce, capacity building. And I want to call out that capacity building in particular is a critical cross-cutting aspect of reducing fragmentation and building sustainable cybersecurity controls worldwide so that the global financial system is even more prepared than we are today to protect against cyber threats. And I think it's also really important to highlight the capacity building aspects across lesser developed nations and lesser developed financial institutions that really do need intensive focus and transference of capacity and capabilities that this recommendation really, I think, hits home on.
Thanks. Rami, do you have anything? Sorry, you started to speak there.
Sorry, and so if I may add to this, I mean, I agree that with Cherry that the financial system is generally more prepared today to deal with major security incidents. And I have to say that the regulators have helped us tremendously by advocating enhanced cyber risk transparency and encouraging the sharing of threat intel across the sector. So we can see really more collaboration, more trust, and as a result of that, more cyber readiness. Obviously, we now need to move from sharing of threat information to actually acting together. And I think that's the next step. Having said that, I think one of the major blind spots are the systemic third parties that we all rely on. We need to push for the continuation of public sector and private sector simulation exercises. The focus should be on severe but plausible scenarios designed to test the resilience of the financial infrastructure, both from a technical and a business perspective, in the event of a major cyber attack on a systemic provider. I would like to mention that the FSB has just published a discussion paper to cover the regulatory and supervisory issues relating to a third-party relationship and outsourcing relationship. It's my view that the focus on this topic is definitely a pertinent one.
Thank you, Rami, for those insights. Turning to you, Ambassador Boris, you're the vice chairman of one of the most important security conferences in the world, where heads of state and ministers come together to discuss the most pressing security challenges in Munich. Listening to the other panelists, where does cybersecurity fall, do you think, in this broader debate? I mean, no one actually dies, nothing explodes when a bank gets hit by a cyber attack. How much should we care? What's at stake?
So it's a pleasure to be part of this group and part of this discussion today, and an opportunity for me to learn from some very distinguished people. Cybersecurity has been a topic at MSC for about 10 years at this point. We started a cybersecurity series in 2012. In 2018 at the MSC, actors from the private sector kicked off something called the Charter of Trust, with which you'll be familiar. And actually this year in February, we had Tim Maurer and Carnegie turn up, and they ran a cyber war game simulating an attack on the financial system. And of course, that is reflected in the report as well. And if I understood correctly, it brought out two things primarily. One, a disconnect in terms of reaction times between actors from the national security, if you like, and the financial sector. And secondly, a disconnect between the US on the one hand and its allies on the other hand in terms of whether to adopt countermeasures and what countermeasures to adopt. So just to say that absolutely we think cybersecurity is very important. We've been engaged on it, and we look forward to working with Carnegie and others on taking it forward.
Thank you, Boris. I don't know whether, Jen, you have Any thoughts about sort of what's at stake here?
Sure, absolutely. Look, I completely agree with Boris. I've served in counterterrorism for many years, so I certainly appreciate the seriousness of events where things are exploding and people are dying. But I think it's well recognized, frankly, that cyber risk is one of the most, if not the most significant business risk. And it's why global banks have invested so much in our cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and why I think we are very much ahead in terms of critical infrastructure sectors. This is about not just critical infrastructure, though. It's about really systemic risk to the sector and potentially the larger global financial ecosystem. So, whether it's the distributed denial of service attacks that I think were alluded to earlier, that we dealt with many years earlier, which actually inspired the build of our original fusion center at Morgan Stanley, or the attack on the Bank of Bangladesh that Sherry mentioned, and concerns about the fragility and the vulnerability of the global payment system. That's really what led us to build our operating model. Certainly, cyber risk can present as existential to the sector and to the system, and I think that's why this report is so important. Clearly, there's a lot of good work that has been done, but much more work that can be done as a sector and also with the rest of the international community. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Ken. It would be great to talk in a bit more detail about the report itself. Sherry, you're currently a non-resident expert at the Carnegie Endowment and a member of the advisory group, together with Rami and Boris. You've been involved in drafting the report released today with the World Economic Forum. What are the key messages from the report about what is necessary to better protect the financial system against cybersecurity threats?
Now, I think in short, just to make it very simple, there's a recognition in the report, and the driver behind the report is that there's a strategic imperative to clarify roles and responsibilities and create more connective tissue among these various silos that are discussed amongst the relevant stakeholders to improve protection against cyber threats. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And, there really, when we go back to the beginning and the evolution of this report of more than a year ago, and the bringing together of stakeholders across the different entities that are involved in this work, there really was no disagreement that was in fact the strategic imperative. I think where you start to see perhaps differing perspectives, which is always incredibly helpful, is when we start to dive into the recommendations and the solutions for addressing those. And that gets particularly tricky, I think, when we're looking at diplomatic versus traditional financial security policy and regulatory engagements. In many parts of the world, those organizations don't talk to each other very much. And that has, I think, a spillover effect into the actual preparedness and strengthening of the overall financial institutions within those geographies and locations. So I think certainly in the near term, the recommendations and the supporting actions that are in the report are really intended to help inform the upcoming G7 and G20 meetings. As you heard from Governor Bailey, he listed off a couple of things that they're particularly looking at that are from the report. And we're obviously going to be working with G20 membership as well to help inform, hopefully, those discussions also. But I think, if we were to go through each one of the pillars and the cross-cutting recommendations, strengthening that operational cyber resilience and collective defense to shield the financial sector against cyber threats, looking at international norms to reinforce norms at the UN and through other relevant processes to ensure that we have clarity about what is considered inappropriate behavior and what malicious activity has crossed a line, and then to be able to hold those malicious actors accountable. I think this particular norm, on this particular recommendation on international norms, is so important and is even more highlighted today after the release of a study yesterday by Verizon. Was their first cyber espionage report that they've ever put out. And it highlights the very, very high degree, high percentage of malicious actors worldwide that are either state or nation state sponsored. So I think this one is incredibly important. The third recommendation is around collective response and how we facilitate collective response to really disrupt malicious actors and more effectively deter future attacks. The workforce issue about how we really ensure that we have access and are expanding models for addressing workforce challenges. We know that our pipelines are limited. We have diversity challenges within the field. How do we really ramp that up? And then the fifth one, which I spoke about previously around capacity building and aligning and expanding those capacity building efforts, not just for financial services institutions, but across government entities as well. And then the sixth area, which we absolutely cannot forget, is around how digital transformation is changing the landscape for security, and how do we ensure that we are providing financial inclusion to safeguard our institutions, as well as to accelerate on the G20's achievements over the past decade in this area. So there's a lot in this report. There's it's got more than 30 recommendations, more than 40 supporting actions. And there's something, I think, for everyone if you really dive deep into it.
Thank you, Sherry. I'd like to turn it to the others now. We heard from the governor and the congressman what they consider to be the most important recommendations from the report. Rami, Jen, Boris, what do you see as its biggest strengths? What are your sort of top three priorities for the implementation of this strategy? Perhaps Rami, if you would like to take this first.
Thank you, Anna. So first of all, this is a great quality output of tremendous collaborative work, and I think that's one of the key strengths. Mobilizing public-private stakeholders, getting the entire ecosystem to really take a step back and think about how we can change the game in terms of managing these cyber threats. I think this is really capturing the true multidimensional nature of the challenge that we as an industry have to deal with. So in terms of priorities for us, I would say that the first one is really reinforcing the collaboration with governments and regulators to promote, greater harmonization on the norms and the cybersecurity requirement. I think we heard that from the governor and the congressman. It's quite important that we recognize that in the past few years, we have seen a number of cybersecurity, data protection, and privacy-related regulations and guidelines emerging around the world. And all of this has been put in place in response to the evolving cyber threat. But the lack of harmonization is a challenge, especially if you are an organization that operates globally. And specifically in the Asia-Pacific region, we have seen a wave of new laws and guidelines on cybersecurity that have been formulated for the first time. So for me, it's quite important that we push for coherent norms that will simplify and quite frankly, raise the effectiveness of our efforts. The second priority, of course, is, again, this is also consistent with what we heard earlier, the growing focus on the topic of operational and cyber resilience. This shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, everything that's going on across the sector, we hear about technology failures, we hear about digital transformation activities that are quite frankly amplified in terms of the pace and the scope and the ambition. We see increased outsourcing, and of course, we see quite a steep evolution in cybercrime. All of this is adding fuel to an ever-expanding and dynamic threat landscape. So for us, when we think about this topic specifically, as it relates to third-party resilience, I think it's important for us that we uncover some of the unsuspected dependencies and unidentified fragilities within the system. So accelerating work on the topic is definitely a high priority to ensure that we manage actively supplier shocks, that we maintain fully de-risked execution paths for our most critical business services. And for me, the time to act on this is really now, especially in the context of the current crisis. Third priority is to increase the focus on data integrity. Jen mentioned this earlier. Data is the new currency, and protecting the trust in the data in an increasingly connected landscape with information fluidly being transferred from many organizations to third parties. This is really critical for us to maintain our collective freedom to operate. I'm worried about incidents that corrupt the integrity and the damage, potentially the privacy of financial data. We can think about records, transactions, algorithms. As the report indicates, very few technical controls and solutions are currently available to counter such attacks. But these attacks have the potential to undermine the very foundational trust and confidence that we need more broadly in the sector. So we need to make sure that we raise awareness around this topic of data integrity, and we understand its implications for the financial infrastructure. So we definitely have our work cut out for us on this topic. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Rami. And Jen, I don't suppose you could chime in and offer your thoughts, your top three.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I thought the whole report was great, so I recommend that everybody read all of it. But, in my role as the head of firm resilience, the first set of recommendations are the ones that really resonated me in that first pillar. Specifically, again, I would just foot stomp what Rami just said, the need to continue to improve and align regulatory oversight efforts. Particularly, given our global presence, that alignment would indeed be really helpful. I would also reinforce what Rami said about vendor resilience, in particular, the recommendation on FMI resilience, as well as, of course, the information on the importance of information sharing. And then what is highlighted in one of the last recommendations on ensuring that banks are prepared for influence operations and hybrid attacks. I thought that was a really insightful point to be made. And then, with respect to the other pillars, I would just highlight the importance of, again, what folks have talked about stronger international norms to protect the financial system, the importance of elevating the fight against cybercrime, and Rami just mentioned that. And then finally, the importance, and I think this is really critical on this workforce point, of finding innovative ways to address the cybersecurity workforce challenges, to include one of the recommendations that was made specifically about retraining and reskilling workers who may have lost their jobs to COVID. I think I would also reinforce, and the Congressman mentioned the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which was also really a fantastic report with a series of really great and important recommendations. And I would commend that work as well, but also in particular their focus on workforce to include building hiring pathways for members of underrepresented communities, to include women and people of color and the neurodiverse. I think that's an incredibly important thing that all of us need to be focused on. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Jen. And Boris, I'm going to hand the floor over to you now.
Thanks. I'll make it short. What the report brings out, obviously, is the need for people to work together from the national security community, financial authorities, financial sector, for people to come together internationally. But there's an important building block here, which is the national security setup. And we at Munich Security Conference produced a report on German foreign policy recently and looked at the, if you like, the architecture that we have in our national security system, which in some ways is lacking. And if you then look at the cybersecurity setup we have in Germany, I think it is lots of actors, responsibilities not clearly delineated. And this is perhaps a German problem and has to do with being a federal state and those things. But I think across nation states, you'll find a situation where there's not the level of coordination or assigned responsibility that you would like. So I think this national security setup is extremely important, needs to be tackled. I think the UK seems to have quite a good model compared to other Western countries. So look at that, look at others who have best practice, and then improve.
Thanks, Ambassador. And Sherry, I'm interested in, we're hearing a lot of recommendations, great, fantastic recommendations here, but sort of what are the main challenges stopping us from getting us where we need to go, from implementing these? And perhaps the Ambassador just gave some examples, but are there places where we're already seeing cooperation and collaboration that we can learn from?
Well, I think there are clearly articulated in the report some of the challenges that we see today to that collaboration, both within countries, as the Ambassador just outlined, as well as to collaboration more broadly, whether it's regional collaboration or even collaboration between government entities and industry. We talked a lot earlier, a number of my fellow panelists talked a lot about trust. And traditionally, there has not been necessarily significant trust between regulators and industry. I think we're seeing that change over time in appropriate ways, but that level of trust also conveys to industry players as well. I think this is a big step that the financial services sector took probably almost 20 years ago now, when we agreed that we would not use cybersecurity as a competitive advantage, that there was a recognition across the sector that we absolutely had to work together, and it was in all of our best interests to work together to address cybersecurity threats. And that has only grown and expanded and continued, I think, over the last 15 years. So while there's certainly challenges, I think there's also a lot of opportunity that we can build on existing connective tissue, connective organizations that, and let's not forget the value of the will. There is incredible will, I think, amongst the sector, both government and industry, to do more, to raise the level of resilience, reduce risk, and really focus on the things that we can do to make demonstrable change. And I think that's where, when we look at the recommendations in the report, it could have gone a lot further, and there's a lot more things that we could have picked from and put in the buckets. But these were the, I think, most critical next 1 to 3 years that were viewed as, where can we make significant progress? Again, building on existing efforts, but also where we have nascent entities and activities, how do we accelerate on those to really drive the changes that we need to see within the sector?
Well, thank you, Sherry. That was a note of optimism there. So the willingness to collaborate. So I think that might be a good place to kind of wrap up. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on all those recommendations in the report, and useful to hear about the various takeaways. A lot of work to do as we moved from a kind of fragmented response globally and within the private sector to a more collaborative response to the threats we face. I believe that's all we've got time for. I want to say a huge thank you to the panelists here today, and hand back over to Tim. It's been a pleasure to host such a rich discussion.
Well, thank you, Hannah, for taking the time to moderate this fantastic panel. And thank you, Boris. Thank you, Sherry, Jen, Rami, and thank you, Governor and Congressman and Jeremy, for the fantastic discussion. For those of you watching, I invite all of you to take a look at the strategy report on our website and the broader FinCyber project. I'd also like to point out that the strategy report was all about the solution piece of it. What should we be doing to better protect the financial system? we actually published a complementary paper today that was written by Adrian Nish, Zahir Noman, and James Muir, which focuses on how the threat landscape has evolved and kind of provides a better picture for why this is different from what we were talking about 10, 20 years ago, and how the threat landscape today is very different, which is why there is a sense of urgency that more needs to be done to protect the financial system. And then if this was just a teaser for you and you'd like to learn more about the topic, I invite you to join us next week for a separate event where we're going to include participants from the Asia Pacific, which due to the time zone difference today weren't able to join. So we're excited to have a follow-up conversation with that part of the world next week. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Arthur Nelson on my team, my full team at Carnegie, and our colleagues in the communications department who worked tirelessly to make this report available today. So thank you all for taking the time. Thanks again to the speakers, and we look forward to staying in touch with you in the future. Have a great day.